The rain came in sheets, hammering the rusted tin roof of the small wooden house as though it wanted to tear the place apart. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Emily Carter sat at the edge of her bed, her knees drawn to her chest, listening to the muffled voices coming from the living room. Her father, Harold Carter, spoke in a low, desperate tone, but every word felt like a hammer blow to her chest. She didn't need to hear everything to know something was wrong. His debts had been hanging over their heads for months, and tonight felt like the night the storm outside had finally found its way in. She crept to the cracked door, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Through the narrow gap, she saw Harold sitting opposite a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored charcoal suit. The man's salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his expensive gold watch catching the dim light of the single bulb overhead. His name was Richard Hawthorne, a name she had heard whispered in town with a mixture of awe and fear. He was powerful, rich, and dangerous. Her father's voice trembled. 300,000, Harold said. That's what I owe. And I don't have it. Richard leaned back in the creaky wooden chair, his eyes cold and calculating. Then give me something else, he said simply, as if discussing the weather. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Something else. What could her father possibly give that would be worth that much money? She watched her father's hands, shaking, restless, as they gripped the edge of the table. I have my daughter, Harold said suddenly, his voice breaking on the last word. Emily's heart stopped. For a moment, the rain was the only sound in the room. Richard's gaze didn't flicker, didn't soften. Instead, a slow smile curved on his lips, the kind that made Emily's skin crawl. Your daughter, he repeated, as if tasting the words. And how old is she? Harold swallowed hard. 19. She's beautiful, well-mannered. She'll make a fine wife. The bile rose in Emily's throat. Fine wife. For a man who looked old enough to be her grandfather. She pressed her back against the wall, her breathing shallow, praying she had misheard. Richard's hand reached for the brown envelope on the table, sliding it toward Harold. The flap was open, and the edges of thick stacks of cash peeked out. This clears your debt, Richard said. In exchange, she belongs to me. The marriage will be arranged immediately. Harold's shoulders sagged in relief, as though selling his only daughter was nothing more than closing a business deal. Emily's nails dug into the wood of the doorframe. She wanted to burst in, scream, run. But her legs felt like lead. When Richard stood, the room seemed to shrink around him. He adjusted his tie, glanced toward the hallway, and his gaze landed directly on her. Emily froze, the way a rabbit does when it senses a predator. His lips curled in a smirk, as if he'd been expecting her. Bring her to me tomorrow, he told Harold, his voice calm but carrying an unshakable authority. She'll be my wife before the week ends. Without another word, he turned and stepped into the storm, the sound of his black leather shoes fading into the night. Emily stumbled back into her room, her mind a whirl of disbelief and terror. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound of her father counting the money in the next room. Each crisp note was like a nail in the coffin of the life she once knew. She thought of her mother, long gone after the divorce, and how she'd sworn she'd protect Emily from the worst parts of this world. But there was no one here now, no one but Harold, who had just traded her away. She lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, the shadows from the rain-drenched window dancing like restless ghosts. Every sound made her flinch. Every creak of the old house felt like the prelude to her being dragged away. When the wind howled through the gaps in the roof, she imagined it was calling her name, warning her of what was to come. Sleep never came. Only the slow, suffocating dread that tomorrow would arrive whether she wanted it to or not. At dawn, the world outside was still gray and wet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Harold appeared in her doorway without knocking, his eyes avoiding hers. Get dressed, he said flatly. Wear something decent. You're meeting your husband. The words cut through her like ice. She sat up slowly, the sheets falling away, revealing the thin, faded nightgown she'd slept in. "I'm not going," she whispered. Harold's jaw tightened. "You'll go. Or I'll make you." Emily stared at him, a thousand thoughts swirling in her mind. Fear, rage, betrayal. But beneath it all, something else began to take root. Resolve. If she had to go with Richard Hawthorne, she would. But she wouldn't stay. She didn't know how or when, but she swore to herself in that moment that she would escape, even if it meant risking everything. The morning light did little to warm the small, damp house. Emily stood in front of the cracked mirror nailed to her wall, brushing her long chestnut hair with trembling hands. Every stroke felt mechanical, as if her body was moving on its own while her mind screamed in 1,000 directions. On the bed behind her lay a pale blue dress Harold had tossed at her before leaving for the market. It wasn't new, she remembered wearing it to church 2 years ago, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She slipped it on slowly, the fabric clinging to her damp skin. In her pocket, she could feel the faint crinkle of the small photograph of her mother, hidden like a secret weapon. By the time Harold returned, his mood had shifted into something unreadable. He didn't speak as he stepped inside, shaking the rain from his shoulders. In his hand was a small black umbrella, not theirs but new, expensive looking. "It's his," Harold said when he caught her staring. "You'll use it." She swallowed hard, knowing he meant Richard Hawthorne. Her father didn't ask if she was ready. He simply gestured to the door, and Emily followed, her feet feeling like they carried stones. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the clouds hung heavy, as if the sky itself was reluctant to watch what was about to happen. The car was waiting, a sleek black Mercedes parked at the end of the muddy driveway. A driver in a gray suit stepped out and opened the rear door without a word. Emily hesitated, looking at the plush leather seats like they were lined with thorns. Harold gave her a firm push, and she stumbled inside. The scent of rich cologne and new leather filled her nose, and across from her sat Richard Hawthorne, perfectly composed in a navy 3-piece suit. His eyes traveled over her slowly, assessing, like one might examine a painting before deciding if it was worth buying. "You clean up well," Richard said finally. His voice low and smooth but laced with something sharp. Emily didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the window, where raindrops slid down like tiny prison bars. Harold climbed in beside her, placing the black umbrella at her feet. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. Richard's lips twitched into the faintest smile, as if amused by Harold's discomfort. The driver shut the door, and the car began to roll forward, the hum of the engine blending with the dull patter of rain. They drove in silence for a while, the village fading into the background as the road curved toward the city. Emily's heart thudded with each mile. Every passing landmark felt like a thread being cut between her and the life she knew. Eventually, the car slowed, pulling into the driveway of an imposing estate surrounded by tall iron gates. The gates swung open without anyone touching them, revealing a mansion so large it seemed to swallow the sky. Marble columns framed the entrance, and perfectly trimmed hedges lined the pathway like silent guards. Inside, the air was cool and scented faintly of roses. The foyer was a vast space with high ceilings, a crystal chandelier dripping light onto the polished marble floor. Emily's shoes squeaked faintly as she followed Harold and Richard toward a massive dining room. A long table stretched across the space, set with fine china, crystal glasses, and a centerpiece of fresh white lilies. At the far end sat an older woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a tailored burgundy dress. Her sharp eyes studied Emily with the precision of a hawk. "This is Margaret," Richard said, gesturing toward the woman. "My sister." Margaret's lips curved in a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So this is the girl," she said softly, as though Emily weren't standing right in front of her. Harold shifted uncomfortably, and Richard stepped forward. "Sit," he told Emily, gesturing toward a chair at his right. She obeyed, though every instinct screamed to run. The soft clink of silverware and the whisper of servants moving in the background filled the air, but the tension at the table was a living thing. The marriage was discussed in blunt, transactional terms. No vows, no romance, no pretense. Margaret asked questions about Emily's schooling, her health, her ability to adapt. Richard talked about timelines and legal paperwork, while Harold nodded along, his hands resting on the black envelope now filled with the rest of his payment. Emily sat silent, her fingers clenched in her lap. She wasn't being spoken to, she was being spoken about, as if she were a purchase that had yet to be delivered. When the meal ended, Richard stood and slipped on his jacket. "You'll move in tomorrow," he told Emily, his tone final. Harold rose as well, clutching the envelope. "She'll be ready," he said quickly, his voice eager, almost relieved. Margaret's gaze lingered on Emily, a strange flicker in her expression. Not sympathy, but curiosity, like someone watching a storm roll in. Richard reached for Emily's arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and led her toward the door. "You'll learn quickly," he murmured, almost as if it were a promise. As the car carried them back to the village, Emily's mind was a whirlwind of fear, rage, and disbelief. She glanced at Harold, who sat counting the money for the third time. His face lit with satisfaction. Richard had said she would move in tomorrow, but tomorrow felt like a death sentence. She looked out at the passing streets, memorizing every turn, every alley, every shop, planting them in her memory like escape routes she might one day use. She didn't know how yet, but she swore silently. She would not let this bargain be the end of her story. The morning came too quickly. Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tracing the faded cracks with her eyes. Every creak of the old house, every soft groan of the wooden beams felt amplified in the stillness. She could hear Harold moving about in the kitchen, the clink of dishes and the scrape of a chair. Her stomach churned, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day she was leaving this house, not as a daughter, but as someone's possession. The thought made her throat tighten until it hurt to swallow. When Harold finally knocked on her door, the sound was sharp and impatient. "Get up," he said. "He's coming." She pulled on the only clean dress she had left, a soft cream-colored one with a small tear near the hem. It wasn't meant for an occasion like this, but it was the best she could manage. She brushed her hair into a loose braid, tying the end with a fraying ribbon. In her pocket, the photograph of her mother remained tucked away, the only anchor she had left. The low hum of an approaching engine made her heart stutter. Through the thin curtains, she saw the black Mercedes glide to a stop outside their gate. The driver stepped out, his gray suit impeccable, his expression unreadable. He opened the back door, and moments later Richard emerged, dressed in a crisp black suit with a deep red tie. He looked completely untouched by the gray skies above, as though the weather bent itself to his will. "Ready?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. Emily didn't answer. Harold gave her a sharp nudge toward the door. She stepped outside, the damp air clinging to her skin, the earthy scent of last night's rain heavy in her lungs. Richard's gaze swept over her briefly before he opened the rear car door himself. "After you," he said, his tone smooth, but Emily felt the steel beneath it. She climbed in, sitting as far from him as the seat allowed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The drive to the city felt longer this time. The narrow village roads gave way to paved highways, the greenery replaced by rows of tall buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly into the gray sky. Richard didn't speak for most of the ride, his attention fixed on a tablet in his hands. The silence pressed in on her, heavy and unyielding. Every so often, she caught his reflection in the tinted window, unreadable, calculating. She wondered what kind of life awaited her in the mansion. When the car finally turned into the estate's driveway, the iron gates opened as though they recognized their master. The mansion loomed ahead, its marble facade gleaming even under the muted sunlight. A line of staff stood near the entrance, their eyes lowered, their postures rigid. Emily's chest tightened. It wasn't just a home, it was a kingdom, and she was stepping into it as a prisoner disguised as a bride. Inside, she was led through grand hallways lined with oil paintings and gold-framed mirrors. The floors were so polished she could see her reflection, pale and tense. Richard walked ahead with long, confident strides, while a woman in a black uniform followed behind Emily, her expression carefully neutral. "This will be your room," Richard said, stopping before a set of double doors. The woman opened them to reveal a large, elegantly furnished space with a four-poster bed, silk curtains, and a view of the sprawling gardens. It was beautiful and suffocating. "Dinner is at 7, Richard said. "Until then you may settle in. If you need anything, speak to Anna here." He gestured toward the uniformed woman, who gave a small nod. "And Emily?" His voice dropped slightly as he stepped closer. "There are rules in this house. You'll learn them quickly." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Anna lingered just long enough to set a folded nightgown on the bed before leaving Emily alone. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers trailing over the fine fabric of the duvet. It felt like a cage dressed in silk. She walked to the window, staring at the high stone walls surrounding the estate. Beyond them the city stretched out, so close yet unreachable. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one ending in failure. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, whispering to herself, "Not forever. I won't be here forever." As evening fell, the soft glow of the chandelier bathed the room in golden light. She dressed for dinner in the nightgown Anna had left, though she had no appetite. When the clock struck 7, she stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a simmering resolve, a promise to herself that no matter how gilded this prison was, she would find the door out. She just didn't know that her first night here would reveal exactly why Richard Hawthorne wanted her. And it wasn't for love. The next morning, Emily was awakened by the sound of knocking, firm, deliberate, with no pause for her to answer. Anna stepped inside without waiting for permission, her expression as unreadable as ever. "You'll need to be ready in an hour," she said, setting a pale ivory dress on the bed. The fabric shimmered faintly in the light spilling from the window. It looked like something pulled from a boutique window, elegant, expensive, but not quite a wedding dress. Emily's heart sank. She had hoped for time to adjust to this new life, but now it seemed Richard's plans were already moving forward. "What is this for?" Emily asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Anna didn't look at her directly. "Today is the ceremony," she said simply, smoothing a crease from the dress. "You'll stand beside Mr. Hawthorne, the papers will be signed, and that will be that. No vows. No guests from her side of the family. No flowers she had chosen. Just a transaction dressed up in fine fabric." Emily touched the dress. It was soft under her fingers, but it might as well have been woven from chains. An hour later, the car rolled out of the estate and toward the city's historic courthouse. Richard sat beside her, perfectly groomed in a tailored black suit with a silver tie. He didn't speak for most of the drive, but when he finally did, his words were calculated. "There's no need for you to say much today," he told her, his gaze fixed out the window. "Just sign where you're told. Look presentable. That's all." Emily clenched her fists in her lap, fighting the urge to ask him why. Why her, why now, why this way? She already knew she wouldn't get an honest answer. The courthouse loomed ahead, its towering columns and stone steps radiating authority. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. A small group of people was already waiting in the ornate ceremonial chamber. A judge in formal robes, a clerk holding a folder of documents, and Margaret, Richard's sister, dressed in deep green silk. Margaret's sharp gaze flicked over Emily, assessing her in silence before offering a polite but insincere smile. "Let's begin," the judge said, his tone brisk and businesslike. The proceedings were shockingly fast. The judge recited a few formal statements, none of which mentioned love, partnership, or choice. When the pen was placed in her hand, Emily hesitated, her fingers trembling. Richard's eyes found hers, calm, cold, unyielding. It wasn't a threat in words, but the message was clear: sign. She scrawled her name on the dotted line, her handwriting barely legible. Richard followed, his signature bold and decisive. When it was over, the judge gave a brief nod and left the room, taking the weight of the law with him. The clerk handed Richard a neatly folded set of papers, which he tucked into his jacket pocket. "Congratulations," Margaret said, though her tone carried none of the warmth the word implied. Emily forced herself to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy. She had imagined her wedding day since she was a child, and this was nothing like it. Afterward, they stepped out into the courtyard, where the sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time that day. Richard offered his arm, and Emily took it reluctantly, knowing cameras were watching. Several photographers snapped discreet pictures from a distance. She realized, with a twist of her stomach, that this wasn't about her at all. It was about appearances. A public image to polish Richard's reputation, perhaps even to cover up something darker. They returned to the mansion in silence. Once inside, Richard handed his jacket to a waiting servant and turned to her. "You'll have the West Wing to yourself," he said, as if granting her a luxury. "Stay out of my study and my private rooms. Meals will be served at fixed times. Follow the rules, and you'll find this arrangement tolerable." Emily met his gaze, refusing to drop her eyes. "And if I don't?" she asked. His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then it won't be." That evening, the mansion was unusually quiet. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, the dress still hanging in her wardrobe like a ghost. She thought of her father, somewhere in the village counting the money he'd earned from her sale. She thought of her mother's face in the photograph she kept hidden. And she thought of Richard's eyes, steady, watchful, as if he already knew every move she might make. The walls felt closer than before, the air heavier. As she prepared to sleep, she overheard faint voices drifting from the hallway. Slipping out of her room, she followed the sound until she reached the half-open door of Richard's study. Inside, Richard and Margaret spoke in low tones. "She doesn't suspect yet," Margaret was saying. "Good. Keep it that way," Richard replied. "Once it's done, she won't have a choice." Emily's pulse quickened, her breath catching. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing. Whatever this marriage truly meant, it was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. The sky outside the West Wing windows had turned an inky shade of blue by the time Emily returned to her room. The quiet in the mansion was suffocating, the kind of silence that didn't mean peace, but watchfulness. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a clock ticked in steady, unyielding rhythm, each second dragging her closer to a night she didn't want to face. She sat at the vanity, brushing her hair in slow, distracted strokes, her mind looping over the words she'd overheard in Richard's study. "She doesn't suspect yet." A soft knock broke the silence. Anna entered carrying a tray, a steaming bowl of soup, slices of warm bread, and a crystal glass of water. She set it down on the small table by the window. "Mr. Hawthorne asked that you eat before resting," she said, her tone as neutral as ever. Emily shook her head. "I'm not hungry." Anna's eyes flickered for the briefest second, a tiny crack in her usual mask. "You should eat," she murmured before leaving, the door clicking shut behind her. Emily stared at the untouched food, her stomach tight with anxiety. What did it mean? Once it's done, she won't have a choice. Was it about her money, her freedom, or something far worse? She pushed the tray aside and crossed to the window. The gardens below were lit by small ground lamps, their glow barely reaching the towering stone walls beyond. Beyond those walls, the city lights blinked in the distance, so close yet unreachable. She wondered if anyone out there could even guess what was happening inside this grand, silent prison. The creak of the door startled her. She turned, expecting Anna, but it was Richard who stepped inside, his presence filling the room instantly. He didn't knock, didn't pause, just walked in like the space belonged to him, which technically it did. "You're still awake," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone she couldn't place. "I couldn't sleep," Emily replied, keeping her tone even. He studied her for a moment before glancing at the untouched tray. "Not hungry?" Emily shook her head. No. Richard's eyes lingered on her for a long, unsettling moment before he crossed the room and stood by the window, looking out at the gardens. "This is a good place," he said. "Safe. Controlled. Everything here has its place. Including you." The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. "I'm not something to be placed," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. He turned his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Maybe not now," he said, "but you will be." He stepped away from the window, moving toward her with slow, deliberate strides. "I expect obedience, Emily. Not because I'm cruel, but because it's necessary. If you follow the rules, life here can be comfortable." The word comfortable tasted like poison to her ears. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes hardened. "Then it won't be," he repeated, the exact same warning he had given earlier. For a moment they just stood there, her by the vanity, him towering over her, the air between them thick with unspoken threats. Then, without another word, he reached down and picked up the photograph she'd kept on the vanity. Her mother's face stared back from the small, worn paper. Emily's breath caught. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You left it out," he replied casually, slipping it back onto the table. "You should be more careful with things you value. They can be taken." It was a warning, she realized. Not just about the photo, but about her freedom, her choices, her very identity. Richard didn't have to raise his voice or make physical threats. His power was in the quiet certainty that he could take anything from her if he wished. He stepped back toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the frame. "Sleep well," he said, though the words felt more like a command than a kindness. Then he was gone, the soft click of the door locking from the outside confirming what she already knew. She was not free. Emily sat back down at the vanity, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the girl in the mirror, her eyes wider, her posture tense, her face pale under the soft lamplight. She touched the photograph of her mother, tracing the edges with her fingers. She whispered under her breath, "I'll get out, Mom. I promise." Saying it aloud made the promise feel heavier, more real. She didn't know how she'd keep it, but she knew she had to. She crawled into the bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin. The house was silent again, but it was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that feels like someone is listening. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she heard footsteps pass by her door, slow and measured. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe evenly. It was only her first night in Richard Hawthorne's house, but Emily already knew one thing. If she didn't start planning her escape soon, she might never get the chance. Comment part 2 to see what happens next.